Let me start with something strange. Right now, wherever you are, I want you to point at yourself. Go on. Actually do it. Lift a finger and point. My guess is that you pointed somewhere around your chest, or maybe your face. Almost everyone does. And in that one small gesture, without even thinking about it, you just made an enormous claim about the nature of reality. You pointed at a very particular arrangement of atoms, this body, this brain, and you said in effect, that's me. That's the thing I am, and it feels obvious. It feels so obvious that it seems almost silly to question it. But I want to sit inside that gesture for a moment, because there is something hiding in it that people almost never stop to notice. Welcome to Feynman's Path. Today we are going to take one very simple, very personal question and follow it all the way down, layer after layer, until it opens onto something far stranger and far more beautiful than you might expect. And I promise you, this is not a video about black holes or quantum mechanics in the abstract. Those things are strange too, but the question I want to ask today is closer to home than any of them. It's about you. And to be honest with you, it might be the most quietly unsettling question you'll ever sit with. Here it is. Before the year you were born, before the month, before the day, you did not exist. And I don't just mean your body wasn't here yet. I mean you weren't sleeping somewhere, waiting. You weren't holding a numbered ticket in some cosmic waiting room, next in line to be born. There was no faint you flickering in the dark, no inner voice, no awareness, nothing. Just absence. Complete and total. And here is where it gets strange. The atoms that make up your body right now, every single one of them, were already here. Not some of them. All of them. The carbon in your bones was forged in the heart of a dying star billions of years before you drew a single breath. The iron carrying oxygen through your veins at this very moment was born in the explosion of a supernova, an event that, for a few brilliant weeks, burned brighter than an entire galaxy. The water moving through your cells today has, statistically speaking, almost certainly passed through the body of someone who lived and died and returned to the earth long, long ago. All of it was already here. Every atom. And yet none of it was you. So let me ask the question plainly. Where were you? Before you were here, where were you? Now, this is not a religious question. Religion has spent thousands of years trying to answer it, and I have real respect for that. But this is a scientific question, and a philosophical one, and for the last several decades, some of the sharpest minds in neuroscience, in physics, in the study of consciousness itself, have been wrestling with it, quietly but fiercely. And the answer they've been fumbling toward is, I promise you, stranger and more astonishing than any old story ever dared to imagine. By the time we're done here, you're going to have a different sense of where consciousness comes from, and of what it actually means that you emerged out of nothing at all. You'll start to see that the boundary between you and the universe is far, far thinner than you thought. And you might just walk away suspecting that the word soul was never quite wrong. It was only ever wearing the wrong clothes. So let's start where almost everyone starts. Let's start with the picture that feels completely, comfortably obvious. Ask people when they began, and 19 out of 20 will tell you some version of the same thing. I began when my body began. A sperm meets an egg. A cell divides and divides again. A nervous system knits itself together. A brain slowly assembles itself out of nothing. And then somewhere in all of that, like a hand reaching into a dark room and flicking a switch, consciousness clicks on. The light comes on, like a candle being lit. And then, eventually, when the body dies, that candle goes out. Puff. Gone. It's a clean story. It's simple and it's tidy. There's a beginning and there's an end. And there's something deeply comforting about that neatness. We like beginnings and endings. They make sense to us. But here's the thing. That's not the end of the story. That's barely the beginning of it. Why? Because the moment you try to ask exactly when the light comes on, this tidy little story suddenly cracks open into something deep and complicated and honestly a little dizzying. When does the light turn on, exactly? At the moment the sperm meets the egg? At the moment the heart first beats? That first tiny thud? Around the 23rd week, when a fetus first responds to pain. At the moment of birth, when a baby first meets the open air. A few months later, when the child first recognizes itself in a mirror. Or is it later still, around the age of 2 or 3, when memory becomes continuous, when the story of me finally starts to be written down? Let me make this difficulty real for you, because it's easy to wave it away in the abstract. Picture a newborn baby. That baby clearly feels things. Hungry, it cries. Warm and held, it settles into a soft, contented coo. There is something happening in there, but does that baby have a sense of I? Is there a thread connecting the baby it was yesterday to the baby it is today, a story running through the middle of it? Almost certainly not. The baby feels each moment whole and complete, but there is no storyteller yet, no narrator stitching those moments into a single life. So is what the baby feels consciousness or not? And if it is consciousness, then can there be consciousness with no self inside it at all? Do you see what's happening? You touch the question once, gently, and three deeper questions come tumbling out behind it. It's like peeling an onion, where every layer you remove reveals another layer underneath, glistening and new. Science does not have a clean answer here. It isn't even close. And that uncertainty, that beautiful and slightly frightening gap in what we know, is exactly where this whole story lives and breathes. I'll tell you what genuinely shocked me when I first took this problem seriously. It was this: we understand almost nothing about what consciousness actually is. And I don't mean that as a throwaway line. I mean it in the strict, academic, almost embarrassing sense. We are astonishingly, humblingly ignorant about the one thing we are most certain we possess. So let's do what a physicist would do. Let's slow down and start from the simplest possible question. What is consciousness anyway? Back in the 1990s, a philosopher gave a lecture that has since become legendary, and in it he split the whole problem cleanly in two. He said, the puzzle of consciousness is really two puzzles. There are the easy problems, and then there is the hard problem. Now, when he called some of them easy, don't misunderstand. He meant easy only in a relative sense. The easy problems include things like this. How does the brain process the information streaming in from your eyes and ears? How do you focus your attention on one thing and ignore the rest? How do all your separate senses get bound together into a single, seamless experience? These are staggeringly difficult problems. But they're the kind of problem where you can at least imagine that with enough research, enough time, enough computing power, we'll eventually crack them. The hard problem is something else entirely. The hard problem is this: why is any of that information processing accompanied by a feeling at all? When light strikes the back of your eye and a cascade of electrical signals pours through your brain like water down a hillside, why does that arrive as the feeling of red? Why isn't it just dark in there? Why isn't there simply nobody home, calculations running flawlessly in total blackness, with no one to experience them? You might think, well, once we fully map the brain's circuitry, consciousness will just fall out of the explanation for free. But here's the trouble. Explaining how the machinery works doesn't explain why there's a felt experience riding along with it. Between the machinery and the experience, there is a gap, an enormous silent gap, and that gap is the hard problem. Serious research has been chipping at it for more than 30 years now, and we have not narrowed it by so much as a fingernail's width. Let me borrow a story here from the great physicist Richard Feynman. When Feynman was a boy, his father used to take him walking in the woods. One day, another kid asked young Richard if he knew the name of a certain bird. Feynman didn't, and the kid teased him, said, "You don't even know that." But Feynman's father had taught him something different. He'd said, "You can learn the name of that bird in every language on Earth, and when you're done, you'll know absolutely nothing about the bird. You'll only know what humans call it. If you want to actually know the bird, watch what it does." Feynman carried that with him for the rest of his life. The name of a thing and the understanding of a thing are two completely different animals, and the word consciousness is exactly like that bird. We have the name. It rolls right off the tongue. But knowing the name has fooled us into thinking we understand the thing, and we don't. Not even a little. Try this yourself. Picture the color red, a ripe apple, or the red of a stoplight. Now, take that feeling of redness, the way it shows up inside you, and try to explain it, using only words, to someone who has never once seen color. You can tell them the exact wavelength of the light. You can tell them which cells in the eye respond, which nerves carry the signal, every last physical fact, and they will still have no idea what red feels like. The feeling simply does not cross over. It won't travel through the words. That's it. That's the thing. The redness of red. The warmth of coffee's smell. The cold bite of ice against your fingertips. Every feeling firing off inside your head at this very moment. Pop, 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 is sitting right at the center of the deepest mystery in the universe. We've just been so busy taking it for granted that we never once stopped to look. There was the deepest riddle in all of existence, hiding inside your morning cup of coffee, and we walked right past it. Now I know what some of you are thinking. Come on, that's just philosophy. That's word games. But it isn't. This has real, heavy consequences. Because if we can't explain why consciousness exists at all, then we certainly can't explain where it was before it existed. Which is to say, before you existed. If we can't solve the hard problem, we can't solve our original question either. They're chained together, link by link. Let me give you a sense of just how big this problem is. Imagine the entire history of the universe stretched out as a single line, the length of a running track, 100 meters from start to finish. The starting line is the Big Bang. The finish line is this exact moment, right now. On that 100-meter line, our whole species, all of humanity, would occupy the last centimeter or so. Every scrap of recorded history, every empire and war and love song ever written would be a faint pencil mark scratched into the very end of it. And your life, your one single life, on that line, it wouldn't even be visible. It would be thinner than the width of a single atom. And yet, you and no one else. You, condensed out of the background stuff that fills that entire 100 meters, and here you are. In the most literal sense imaginable, you are the universe looking at itself through your own two eyes, through your own strange and particular consciousness. Sit with that for a second. Really let it land. The universe is looking at itself, right now, and it's doing it through you. So then, before you were you, where was that consciousness? Let's start going down one layer at a time. The first answer is the one most neuroscientists today take as their starting point. Consciousness, they say, emerges out of complexity. Let me explain it the way you'd explain it to a sharp 12-year-old. Think about a traffic jam on the highway. We've all sat in one. Down at the level of a single car, the rules are dead simple. Don't hit the car ahead. Keep a reasonable distance. Obey the signals. That's basically it. But rise up in a helicopter and look down at that same stretch of road and something remarkable appears. You see a wave. A great rolling wave of stopped and starting traffic, moving slowly backward against the direction of the cars, as if it had a life and a logic all its own. And that wave is real. You can point at it. You can measure its speed. But come back down to the road, take a single car apart, bolt by bolt, and the wave is nowhere to be found. There's no wave component tucked inside the engine. The wave lives in the relationships between the simpler things. It rises up out of them. Emergence, this idea is called, says that consciousness is exactly like that traffic wave. Inside your head, you have somewhere around 86 billion neurons. And here's a number worth pausing on. That's roughly the same as the number of stars in our galaxy. 1 neuron for every star in the Milky Way, packed into the space behind your eyes. But no single one of those neurons is conscious. A neuron on its own just fires, or doesn't. On or off. It's a tiny biological switch, nothing more. And yet, arrange those 86 billion switches into the very particular architecture of a brain, lay down hundreds of trillions of connections between them, and set them all firing in rhythm with one another, and something extraordinary rises up out of the whole. An inner world. A you. There was a researcher who spent his entire life mapping which parts of the brain, when damaged, take which pieces of the self down with them. Injure the region that lays down new memory, and a person becomes trapped forever in the present moment, unable to hold on to a single new experience. Injure the region that gives you the feeling of living inside your own body, and a person can begin to feel like a ghost drifting behind glass, watching their own life happen to someone else. So if consciousness really does rise up out of the structure of the neural network, then the answer to our question seems clear. Before your brain was assembled, before those 86 billion neurons were woven into that particular pattern, there was simply no ground for you to stand on. And because there was no ground, there was no you. It's like a symphony that hasn't been composed yet. The instruments all exist, the musicians are gathered, but the symphony itself isn't anywhere in the world, not until the first note sounds. Follow that a little further. A symphony exists only while it's being played. When the last note fades, where does the symphony go? It vanishes. And yet the sheet music remains, the instruments remain, the musicians remain. Play it again tomorrow, and the symphony comes back to life. Maybe consciousness is like that, a living performance that exists only while the instruments, the neurons, are sounding together in a particular rhythm, which would make you a piece of music being performed fresh in every instant. Stop the playing, and you're gone. Start it again, and you return. The music that fell silent last night when you fell asleep, and rose again this morning when you woke. It's a satisfying explanation. It sounds scientific. It feels like it answered the question. But hold on, the story doesn't end here. Still with me? This idea of emergence only ever tells us about correlation. It says, change the brain's activity and you change the experience. Fine. That much it delivers. But it never tells us why there's an experience in the first place. It never gets us across that river we called the hard problem. It's drawing careful pictures of the shadow on the wall while never explaining why there's a light casting the shadow at all. And there's a nastier problem lurking here. Follow me carefully. Imagine a being that is physically identical to you in every way. Every neuron firing in the same pattern, every behavior the same, every word it speaks, every tear it sheds, every laugh it lets out, exactly like yours, identical down to the atom, with one difference. Inside it, there is no experience. Nobody home. The lights are on, but there's no one in there feeling the light. Is such a being possible? Can you even imagine it? A lot of people, when they think it through, find that yes, they can imagine it. And if that being is even logically possible, if identical machinery alone can't guarantee an inner experience, then this first explanation, consciousness just emerges from complexity, has a hole in it the size of a galaxy. If something in you just went, wait, that's odd, good. Hold on to that doubt, because from here on, it only gets stranger. Now here, quite naturally, a deeper question drifts across the mind. If complexity alone can't explain consciousness, then maybe consciousness isn't something the brain manufactures at all. Maybe it was somewhere else to begin with, and this is where things get genuinely weird. In the late 1980s, a mathematician who would later win the Nobel Prize in Physics published a provocative book. He argued that human consciousness could not be explained by ordinary computation, that something else, something quantum mechanical, was going on inside our heads. A few years later, a neuroscientist joined forces with him and proposed something even more radical. The two of them suggested that consciousness arises from quantum processes happening inside tiny protein structures within our neurons, in minuscule tubes deep inside the cells. Not at the level of the traffic jam, the neurons and their connections, but far, far deeper, down in the cellular basement. This is a realm where a single particle can exist in several states at once, quantum superposition, and where two particles can stay linked by an invisible thread no matter how far apart they drift, quantum entanglement. Things that make no sense at all by the rules of everyday life. And the claim was that these quantum effects might play a direct hand in shaping our experience. Of course, this theory was controversial. Plenty of scientists pushed back hard. The brain is warm and wet and noisy, they said. It's about the worst possible place for something as delicate as a quantum effect to survive. Quantum weirdness usually only reveals itself in extremely cold, extremely quiet laboratories. But here's the thing. In the 2010s, a research team found something that stopped everyone in their tracks. In photosynthesis, the process by which plants turn sunlight into food, right there inside a warm, wet, living cell, they found traces of quantum behavior. Not in a lab chilled to near absolute zero, but inside a leaf in a summer garden. Nobody saw it coming. Everything we thought we knew said quantum effects could never endure at the warm temperatures of biology. And that knowledge turned out to be wrong. Here I'm reminded of an attitude Feynman held on to his whole life. Nature, he liked to say, is under no obligation to make sense to us. No matter how absurd something feels to our intuition, if the experiment says it's true, then it's true. Our certainty that quantum weirdness couldn't survive inside warm, living things was simply, flatly, wrong in the face of nature. So think about what that opens up. If consciousness really is entangled with the quantum fabric of reality, if consciousness is not something the brain produces, but something the brain tunes into, then everything shifts. Then asking where consciousness was before your brain existed becomes exactly like asking where the radio signal was before you switched on the radio. Sit with this one for a moment. Picture an old radio. You turn the dial, whoosh, and music pours out. Did the radio's little parts manufacture that music out of nothing? Of course not. That signal was already there, drifting through the air, before you switched the radio on, before radios were even invented. There simply wasn't a receiver to catch it. And if consciousness is like that, then your brain isn't a machine that invented consciousness. Your brain is a receiver, catching a signal that was flowing through the universe all along. And this idea carries us straight to one of the most radical notions in all of modern consciousness research. The idea that consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe, woven into the very bottom layer of everything. It isn't actually a new idea. It runs back through centuries, all the way to the ancient Greek philosophers. Consciousness, on this view, doesn't suddenly leap out of dead, unconscious matter one day. Instead, all matter has carried a faint trace of it from the very beginning. Now, before you dismiss that as mysticism, hear me out to the end. A neuroscientist built a theory of consciousness armed with rigorous mathematics. In this theory, consciousness isn't something the brain does. It's a property the system has. More precisely, it's the property of a system that integrates information in a way that can't be broken apart. The more densely, the more inseparably a system weaves its information together, the more consciousness it has. And this theory, controversial as it is, arrives with iron logic at a single conclusion. Even the simplest system, however dim, however unimaginably far from our own rich experience, carries some faint flicker of experience. This isn't a poem. This is mathematics, peer-reviewed, published, and argued over fiercely by serious people to this very day. But let me be honest with you here, because I think Feynman would insist on it. This is our best current guess, and nothing more. It has not been proven. There are many respected scientists who reject it outright. The most common objection goes like this. So, you're telling me a rock is conscious? The thermostat on my wall feels something? And honestly, said like that, it sounds ridiculous. But the theory doesn't actually say that. It says a system that integrates information almost not at all has an experience almost equal to zero. The atoms in a rock barely integrate any information with each other. So the point was never about having it or not having it. It's about how deeply integrated a thing is. A matter of degree. It'll still sound strange to you. Of course it will. There's a famous question philosophers have been asking for a long time. What is it like to be a bat? A bat shoots sound out of its mouth and sees the world by the echoes that return. And we simply cannot know, not if we lived 1,000 years, what that feels like from the inside. There's no way in. And what that question teaches us is this. Inner experience can never, ever be touched directly from the outside, no matter how carefully you take the thing apart. You can only ever know your own inner world, which is exactly why we can't confidently declare how far consciousness does or doesn't spread through this universe. Maybe we're floating in an ocean of it, staring so hard at the inside of our own skulls that we never notice the water. If this theory is even roughly right, then the atoms of this universe carried a faint hum of experience from the very start. Nothing you'd call a thought, or self-awareness, or you, but something. And when those atoms gathered themselves into stars and supernovas and planets and simple chemistry and single-celled life and nervous systems, and finally into a brain that could look up at the stars and wonder where it came from, that experience didn't pop out of nowhere. It accumulated, it deepened, it organized itself, patiently, over billions of years, until it arrived here. Let me make this real for you. Take a slow, deep breath right now, very slowly. In the air that just entered your lungs, statistically, there are at least a few molecules that were once breathed out by someone who lived a very long time ago. Someone's last breath, exhaled in a field thousands of years past, spun around and around the planet and just now drifted into your chest. Air mixes that widely and wanders that long. In the breath you just took without thinking, there might be a vanished forest and a cooled campfire and somebody's final goodbye. The atoms that make up your body were not one of them made new. Every single one was borrowed from somewhere. They gathered for a little while into the shape of you, and one day they'll scatter again, and become soil, and become grass, and become part of somebody else. So you are less a suit of clothes the universe put on, and more a dance the universe is dancing for a moment. When the music stops, the dance disappears, but the body that danced remains, and goes on to dance another dance. Your dance happens exactly once. The matter doing the dancing is forever. Let me pause here, because I want this to reach you. You are not made of stars only, in some poetic, greeting card way. If these theories are even approximately right, then you are literally rearranged stardust that has become capable of feeling awe at itself. The consciousness you're experiencing right now is not something separate from the essence of the universe. It is the essence of the universe, condensed and complicated by billions of years of evolution, finally arriving at the point where it can turn to itself and ask, where was I before I got here? The question folds back into itself. You are the universe trying to understand itself, made out of the very stuff you're trying to understand. Now, some of you are thinking, all right, this is lovely, but you're dodging the real question. Forget the stars and the quantum fields for a second. What about the actual me, the one who remembers being a child, who knows my own name, who carries my own private fears and loves and secrets? Where was that me before I existed? That's a fair question. A completely fair question, and I'm going to take you a layer deeper now, because honestly, the most unsettling part of this whole story is only just beginning. More and more research in neuroscience and psychology has started to whisper something quietly disturbing. That continuous you, the one that feels like it's been here all along, from your earliest memory right up to this exact moment, may not be quite what you think it is. It may be a story, an impossibly convincing story, but a story. Now wait, that does not mean you don't exist. Of course you do. You're experiencing something right now, as we speak. What I'm saying is different. That feeling of being a single, solid, unchanging person who wakes up every morning and falls asleep every night as the very same someone, that stable, dependable lump at the center of you, may itself be something the brain assembles after the fact. A narrative your brain busily weaves and then shows to you as though it had been there from the start. Want the evidence? In the 1980s, a neurophysiologist ran a now famous experiment. He asked people to flex their wrist whenever they felt like it, and to note the exact moment they first felt the urge to move by watching a clock. At the same time, electrodes on their scalp recorded the electrical activity of the brain. What he found was quiet, but deeply jarring. The brain's preparation to move began to rise well before the person felt the conscious decision to move. In other words, before the conscious mind felt that it had decided, the brain was already getting the action ready. Later studies pushed this even further. By watching brain activity alone, researchers could predict which of two buttons a person would press with decent accuracy several seconds before the person felt they had chosen. Let me say that again. Several seconds. Several seconds before you feel you've decided something, your brain has already begun moving toward the decision. Which means the conscious experience of choosing might sometimes be a running commentary on something already underway. Not the starting gun of the action, but the broadcaster narrating the race. It sounds bizarre the first time you hear it, I know. But sit with it calmly for a moment. The brain moves first, and the conscious you comes along afterwards saying, yes, I did this, smoothing it all into a tidy story. There's something even stranger. There are people whose two brain hemispheres have been surgically disconnected, the bridge of nerve fibers between them severed, usually as a medical treatment. Show these people an image in one eye only, so the information reaches just the half of the brain that doesn't handle speech, and they'll act on what they saw. But ask them why they did it, and the speaking half of the brain, which never saw the image at all, will invent a perfectly plausible reason, with total confidence. These people aren't lying. They sincerely believe the story they just made up. It turns out that one side of our brain houses a kind of storyteller, a system whose whole job is to gather the fragments of behavior and feeling bubbling up from below the surface of awareness and stitch them into one smooth, believable narrative. A neuroscientist called it the interpreter. Its only task is to spin a coherent first-person story out of the swirling chaos of incoming information. It doesn't discover the self. It invents the self, moment by moment. Now connect that to something written down about 2,500 years ago. An ancient teaching that there is no fixed self. The heart of that teaching was never that you don't exist. It was that the solid, sharply bordered me you believe yourself to be is actually far more fluid, far more interconnected, and far less fixed than it appears. A thin conceptual shell laid over a flowing stream of experience. So what is that stream? The old teachers used a beautiful image. They compared the self to a river. When you look at a river and say that's the Mississippi, the river seems like one solid thing. It has a name, a location, you can photograph it, point to it on a map, but look closely. The water molecules that made it the Mississippi yesterday have already flowed out to sea and are gone. Their place has been filled by new water from upstream, and that water too will be gone by tomorrow. A river is not a thing. A river is a process. A flow that endlessly replaces the water it's made of while holding on to nothing but its pattern. This isn't poetry, it's fact, and it hands us a decisive clue about our original question. If the self is not a thing but a process, not a rock, but a river, then asking where the self was before it began is like asking where the Mississippi was before the mountains that feed it even existed. There was no Mississippi. There was water, and there was rock, and there was gravity. And then the conditions lined up just so. And a river organized itself and began to flow. You are that river. which brings a deeper, more personal question drifting across the mind. If the self really is a flowing river, then what happens in those moments when the flow seems to stop every single night? What do I mean? I mean sleep. Tonight, you'll go to bed. You'll slip under the covers and drift off. And during the deepest, dreamless stretch of that sleep, for those few dozen minutes, you effectively do not exist. Think about it carefully. During that time, you have no experience at all. Not even darkness. Not even the sense of time passing. Just nothing. And then, in the morning, the alarm goes tick, 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 and you wake. And you assume without a flicker of doubt that the person who fell asleep last night is the very same person waking up now. But wait, how can you be so sure? In that deep sleep, the flow was clearly cut. The river stopped. And the water that begins flowing again this morning, is it really the same river as last night's? Every single night we experience our consciousness switch off completely, and every single morning it switches back on, and never once do we find it frightening. If anything, sleep is sweet. We surrender to it gladly, so here a strange comparison rises up. Sleep and death. The two are so alike that the old poets called sleep the little brother of death. In both, consciousness goes out. In both, the flow stops. And yet one we love, and the other we fear. What's the actual difference? Think it through, and the difference is just one thing. Sleep leaves open the potential to switch back on. The riverbed is still there for the water to flow again. Death is when the riverbed itself is gone. So the fear of death, precisely stated, isn't fear that something arrives. It's grief that the possibility of flowing again is lost. And here is the genuinely strange part. The real reason the nightly break in the flow doesn't terrify you is that the you who wakes up in the morning immediately sews the gap shut with a seamless story. That empty hole between last night and this morning gets filled in, invisibly, by that storyteller in the brain. You never even notice the hole, because it feels as though there was never any break at all. Between last night's you and this morning's you, there was, in fact, a black gap of nothing, and you have never once seen it, because you only ever wake up after it's already been mended. Sit with this quietly. That smooth sense of continuity, the feeling that you've been the same single person your whole life, is actually the product of a hole that opens every night and gets patched every morning, over and over. The way the Mississippi is still the Mississippi, even without a single drop of yesterday's water, you are still you, even though your consciousness went out cold last night and came back on this morning. Why? Because you were never the water. You were the pattern, the way of flowing. So now our original question suddenly feels intimate and close. That vast, impossible question of where you were before you were born turns out to be no different from the question of where you were just before you woke this morning in the depths of dreamless sleep. You were nowhere, and the flow began again anyway. The flow can stop, and the flow can start again. Every night, every morning, you undergo a small vanishing and a small rebirth, and you simply don't notice. Remember this. You are already, once a night, blooming out of nothing. And now we've arrived at the deepest point, the place where all of these paths converge. This is the moment where the way you see the world quietly turns over. Stay with me here. So far we've looked at where consciousness rises from, whether it's a fundamental property of the cosmos, whether the self is really just a story. And all these paths, starting from such different directions, end up pointing at the very same place, which is this. Maybe our original question was malformed from the start. Where was my soul before I drew my first breath? That question. Grammatically, it looks fine. But it may be an empty question. Picture a candle. Before you lit it, where was the flame? Was there a tiny flame crouched and hiding inside the wax? Of course not. A flame is not a thing. It's a process, an event that happens when wax and oxygen and heat meet under just the right conditions. The reason you can't locate the flame before you light it isn't that the flame was tucked away somewhere. It's that the flame isn't a hidden object at all. It's an event that occurs the moment the conditions are met. And your soul, the particular shape of consciousness that is you, may be exactly the same. Before it began, it was not an object filed away somewhere. But this is not where it ends. Because at the very same time, there's another possibility. And here's where it gets beautiful. What if the pattern that became you, the unique form of consciousness that is you, was, in some genuine sense, already latent within the universe, written into the laws of physics, into the structure of chemistry, into the evolutionary pressures that shaped the very nervous system you're using right now to follow my words? encoded, like a possibility, waiting. The universe did not stamp out your consciousness the way a factory presses out identical parts. The universe grew you slowly, the way raindrops gather into a river, the way gas gathers into a star, the way chemistry gathers into life. In the language of quantum mechanics, you were always there in a superposition of infinite possibilities. And your birth was the moment all those countless possibilities collapsed, settled into one astonishing, particular being. That is not nothing. That is very far from nothing. So hold both of these at once. On one side, the voice that says, you were nowhere before you were born, there was no thing that was you. And on the other, the voice that says, you were always there as a possibility, a place in the laws of the universe where your pattern was waiting to bloom. Sounds like a contradiction, doesn't it? But it isn't one, not really. Come back to the flame. Before you struck the match, the flame was nowhere. That's simply true. But that doesn't mean the possibility of the flame was absent. The wax and the wick and the oxygen were already there. The conditions for the flame were in place from the beginning. The flame wasn't there, but the potential for the flame was. And you are exactly the same. There was no thing that was you. But the possibility of you slept quietly in the universe for nearly 14 billion years. So the real answer to where you were might have this shape. You were nowhere, and at the same time you were latent everywhere. In starlight, in the laws of physics, in the grain of the flowing river. This is not a word game. This is the truth of the river. Now let's pull back from that dizzying cosmic scale and come home to the small, quiet places where we actually live. Let me tell you about a father. When his daughter was around 5, she said to him one day, Dad, before I was born, I was in the sky, waiting. And it struck him how instinctively the child reached for the idea of an unbroken continuity, of always having existed somewhere. She wanted to know that she had never not been, that there was no time when she simply wasn't, that the universe had kept a warm seat saved for her, the way you save a table at a restaurant. That father didn't know what to say. He says he still doesn't, entirely. But here's what he came to believe, that the real truth is actually far more comforting than the phrase in the sky ever was. What does he mean? When he looks up at the night sky, not just glancing but really looking with his whole heart, he holds onto one concrete fact. Every calcium atom in his teeth was forged in the heart of a star. This is not a metaphor. Literally, physically, in a furnace of tens of millions of degrees, in the collapsing core of a star, in real nuclear reactions, those atoms were made. That calcium was flung out into space when the star died, drifted through clouds of dust, sailed for billions of years, passed through our forming solar system, and finally settled onto some corner of the Earth. It dissolved into groundwater. It was drawn up into plants. An animal ate the plant, and a person ate the animal, and it passed down through generations, until one day it became part of a human body. And now, with that very calcium, a man bites into an apple in the morning, crisp and cold, and then he lifts his head to a sky full of stars and thinks, I recognize you. When he remembers the almost miraculous, statistically absurd fact that atoms which have always been here happen to arrange themselves into something capable of feeling awe, he can no longer quite bring himself to call the arrangement mere coincidence, not in any supernatural sense, but in the sense that the laws of physics themselves seem, somehow, to lean toward complexity, toward organization, and, if I dare use the word, toward experience. Let me tell one more Feynman story here. Feynman was known for not fearing death very much. Why? Because he saw himself as a temporary gathering of atoms, briefly assembled, soon to scatter. He liked to think that when he died, the atoms that made him up would simply disperse and become other parts of the universe. Not vanish, just move. To Feynman, death was something like an actor stepping onto the stage for a scene and then stepping off. The stage itself, the universe itself, was so vast and so old that his own brief entrance and exit were just one small scene in an immense play. And I don't find that cold or empty. I find it the very opposite. Feynman drew from the fact of being part of the universe not fear, but a deep sense of belonging, that even when I'm gone, the things I was made of stay here, that the atoms I briefly borrowed flow on into other stars and other lives. That's not an ending. It's one stretch of an enormous flowing thing. The way a river reaching the sea doesn't mean the water disappears. It just returns to a larger body of water. You've probably had a moment like this yourself, looking quietly at someone you love, when suddenly, with no warning, the heavy weight of it lands on your whole body, the knowledge that this person cannot last forever, that this particular arrangement of atoms, this person's own intricate and singular pattern of experience, will someday scatter, that the river will, in the end, stop flowing. And in that moment, what you feel is not fear. It is the most honest form of love there is. The kind that loves while knowing everything. That aching beauty, felt at the edge of impermanence, may be the closest we ever get to understanding why consciousness exists at all. Consciousness isn't only for surviving, though it surely helps with that. It isn't only for passing on our genes. Maybe it's for exactly this, the ability to stand at the edge of the void and feel that it's beautiful. To look at a single flower, or the face of a sleeping child, and feel something no equation could ever fully hold. Picture tomorrow morning. You'll get up the way you always do, brew a warm cup of coffee, squeeze onto a crowded train, and head off to work. A perfectly ordinary morning. But the warmth of that cup against your palms, the scenery blurring past the window, the light brush of a stranger's shoulder against yours, each of those small feelings took nearly 14 billion years to become possible. The universe spent all that time making stars and breaking them and making them again, scattering atoms, forging life, until at last it became something that could feel the warmth of a coffee cup. And that something is you. So the next time you're on your morning commute and you happen to glance out the window, just take 3 seconds and remember this. The thing looking at this scenery isn't only you. It's the universe, looking at itself. Those 3 seconds might quietly change an ordinary day. You were not here before you were born, but every particle that makes you up was here, has always been here, and in some form always will be. It's only the particular pattern that is you, this specific symphony of electrical signals and memory and sensation and meaning woven together that never once existed before and will never exist the same way again. And that symphony is playing right now. Not tomorrow, not in some theory, but this very moment. As my words reach your mind, as you turn them over, as something inside you resonates or doesn't. This is the scene where consciousness is happening. This is the universe experiencing itself. So let me say it plainly. Everything we've walked through today points in a single, astonishing direction. You are not an object that got made and will get unmade. You are a process the universe has been shaping over billions of years, and unlike a thing, a process is defined not by what it is, but by what it does. A river is a river not because of what substance it's made of, but because it flows. Here at Feynman's Path, I don't want to just hand you a heavy unease and leave you there. I want to give you something to carry into your ordinary day. So let me offer a few quiet shifts in perspective. First, the question "who am I?" becomes far more interesting when you swap it for "what am I becoming?" The self doesn't sit still. On this, neuroscience is nearly unanimous. The brain's ability to rewire itself in response to experience continues your entire life. You are not locked forever into the pattern you were handed at birth. You are a river, and you have far more power to change your own course than you think. Second, against the staggering history of the atoms in your body, your single lifetime is one final word at the end of an impossibly thick book. But those atoms chose, for one brief flicker, to be you. Not rock, not gas, not sea mud, but you. That specialness is not nothing. It's worth sitting still with for a moment and quietly savoring what it means. Third, the fact that we can't finally explain why consciousness exists is not a failure of science. It's an invitation. It's the universe leaning in and whispering that there is still this much left unknown. And that unknown territory is exactly where awe lives and breathes. Anyone who tells you that science has stripped the world of its mystery and made it dull simply hasn't read the book carefully. The more honestly you look, the more mysterious and magnificent the world becomes. Fourth, the fact that the storyteller in your brain is endlessly composing the story of you means you have some real say in editing that story. Not infinite power, not magic, but genuine power. The stories we tell ourselves actually shape the neural wiring of the self. This isn't a self-help slogan. It's where decades of neuroscience have landed. Fifth, the fact that you did not exist before your first breath does not diminish your worth. It concentrates it. Every moment you exist happens exactly once, can never be repeated, and is made of the oldest matter in the universe. You are, in the most literal sense language allows, stardust that has learned to feel awe at itself. The most astonishing thing about you isn't anything you've achieved. It's the simple, staggering fact that against odds no lottery could ever describe, you exist here at all. Think of everything that had to happen. The universe had to begin nearly 14 billion years ago. Stars had to be born and then die. Their deaths had to scatter the ingredients from which Earth was shaped. Life had to spark on that Earth. Billions of years of evolution had to run, unbroken, not snapping even once. And at the end of it, your parents had to meet. And out of hundreds of millions of possibilities, the one particular combination that is you had to appear. Break any single link in that endless chain and you're not here. But every link held, every one. And so here you are. Let me leave you with one last image. Imagine the whole of it, nearly 14 billion years. For almost all of that unimaginable stretch, the universe never once looked at itself. Stars blazed, and no one felt they were beautiful. Galaxies wheeled through the dark, and no one held their breath at the sight. The universe simply unfolded, magnificent and silent, with not a single spectator. And then one day, in one small corner, a piece of that matter folded itself over and over, delicately, endlessly, until at last it opened its eyes. And the universe looked at the universe for the first time. Your eyes are those eyes. When you gaze up at the night sky, that is the universe standing before a mirror for the first time in nearly 14 billion years, and you are the mirror. Let's trace the path we walked today, slowly, and then I'll let you go. We began with a simple, slightly unsettling question. Before you existed, where were you? We found that neuroscience can't cleanly say when consciousness begins. We saw that knowing every circuit in the brain still won't tell us why there's an experience at all, the hard problem. We opened the door to the possibility that consciousness is entangled with quantum reality and stepped into the radical mathematics that says consciousness might be a fundamental property of the cosmos. We sat with the uncomfortable possibility that the self is a story the brain writes after the fact. And following the river, we arrived at the conclusion that the self is not a solid rock, but a pattern, a flow, a process, endlessly trading out the water it's made of while keeping its shape. And finally we came to this. You are not an object made out of nothing. You are the universe, which spent billions of years learning how to experience itself, at last condensing, collapsing, into one irreplaceable pattern that will never come again, into you. Thank you truly for spending this long, deep thought with me today. Questions like this deserve to be shared with someone. So let me leave you with one final question of my own. Go back to the oldest fragment of memory you can find, the very first one, and ask yourself quietly, was that truly the moment you began? Or was it just the first moment the brain started keeping a record? Tonight, before you fall asleep, think about it one more time. And I'll see you next time on Feynman's Path, with another beautiful riddle to unravel together. Take care of yourselves.